All right, we're in lesson number 11 in our Sunday school today, and we're going to be starting pretty much in Exodus chapter 20. Exodus 20. And we're going to look at a few different passages today as we're gathering some thoughts here about the responsibility of children to parents. And we're in the unit that's parents and children. We've been talking quite a bit about how that the responsibility, what the responsibility is of the parents to the children, and how that parents are to raise their children. We've been hitting hard on the parents last few weeks, and we're going to hit hard on the children today and see what the Bible would have to say of how the responsibility is of children to parents. And this will be some valuable stuff to look at today. It says right under the title there, God's Word instructs children to honor and obey their parents. And we want to break that apart and kind of talk about that as we go, and how that changes to an extent in the obedience part as life goes on. And we'll talk about that some more. The lesson overview says this: just as parents have an obligation from God's Word to raise their children properly in the ways of the Lord, so children have a biblical obligation to their parents. Children are to obey their parents with proper respect. Children are always to honor their parents. As children become adults and go their own way, the idea of obedience to parents naturally ends. The obligation of children to honor their parents is lifelong. Today's lesson will examine the scriptures that discuss children's obligation to obey and honor their parents. These texts will also discuss how children can honor and care for their parents when they become older. And there is one verse that has a line in it that they have for us here today that talks about your mother when she is old, that we're not to despise our mother when she is old. We'll talk about that some more here in a little bit. But our golden text, we'll read this before we get into the main scriptures. The golden text is Ephesians 6:2-3. Honor thy father and mother. We'll be coming back to this, by the way. Honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with thee, and thou mayest live long on the earth. Okay, so we'll come back to that. And let's go to Exodus 20 now. And as I say, we're going to look at multiple passages. This verse right here comes from the 10 Commandments, and it's the 5th commandment that God gave to his people through Moses. So let's look at that verse number 12 in Exodus chapter 20. It says, honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Now, we look at verses like this and we think about, well, what does it say in the New Testament compared with the Old Testament and all that kind of stuff. And this is one of those verses that is repeated to a great extent in the New Testament, just like our golden text had. The Ephesians 6 passage there basically has the same verse, only it's a little bit translated, you might say, into our time. Because when you look at this here, take that last part of verse 12 where it says, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Now in that context, we seem to be talking about the promised land, the land of Canaan. Honor your father and your mother that you may get to dwell in the land of Canaan for a long, long time. And some of the idea there may also be the longevity of life personally for an individual as well. But notice how it translated that into our time in Ephesians 6, where it said that it may be well with thee, and thou mayest live long on the earth. Now, we're not living over in Israel in the land of Canaan as some people are today, and as they did back then. But the promise translates to us today in America is that, hey, it's going to be well with you if you will honor your parents. That'll be a key to it being well with you. And also, it'll help you to live long on the earth. And as we've already talked about in another promise about fearing the Lord and lengthening your days, doesn't necessarily mean that everybody that honors their parents is necessarily going to live to 90, 100, 105 years old. But it will lengthen our life from what it would have been if we had not honored our parents. There is a lengthening of life here. Now let's talk about this idea of honoring father and mother, and we'll kind of progressively talk about this as we go. But a definition of what it would mean to honor would be basically this: the idea of considering them to be very great, to give them respect Here's another idea, also to consider them to be heavy. Now, I'm not talking about weight. I'm talking about the idea of heavy in the sense of the influence upon your life, the impact that they make upon your life, the direction that you take based upon what they would think. In other words, you consider them to be heavy in your life. They carry weight, you might say, in your thinking, in your decision making, in the way that you show them honor. You have them carry weight in your mind. You're lifting them up in your heart and mind, esteeming them in a place of honor and respect. One commentator said this: to honor one's parents includes to prize them, to care for them, and to show respect or reverence to them. The command is given to children, but not for only while they are children. And that's kind of a deal about this as we think about the obedience factor to a child that's growing up under their parents' authority and so forth. But then we kind of think about that different as we go on. A 70-year-old is not under the same obligation to obey their parents as a 7-year-old. Would you agree? Can you imagine, being 70 years old and you have your mother and it's like, okay, I've got to figure out what to do here. It's a little different as you go on. But the honor is still there. The command to honor is still intact, still in place, and we are to honor them as we go. Now, let me go ahead and say something that I had in my notes almost at the very end, because it'll help us as we go if you're in one of these situations. What do you do when you have a parent that in your thinking you would say is not worthy of honor? Now, let me correct that a little bit from the beginning. They're still worthy of honor, even if their conduct has not been worthy of honor. Here's the truth of it. We can honor them in their position without honoring them in their lifestyle. We can honor the office of parent and them as our mother, as our father, even if they didn't treat us right, even if it was an abusive situation, neglectful, absent, whatever it would be. We can still honor them as the position that they are in our life without honoring the actions that they committed. You see what I'm saying? Same deal in politics, isn't it? We don't always agree with everybody that is in office, in any office in our land, but we still honor the position. We honor the person in that position, and we don't necessarily agree with everything that they do, whichever side of the aisle that you would be thinking on. We can honor the position without honoring the conduct of the individual. Same way with parents. It doesn't say, honor thy father and thy mother as long as they treat you good. No. Does it say, honor thy father and thy mother as long as they don't walk out on you? No, it's honor thy father and thy mother. And the Lord will bless us. It'll bless our soul and it'll bless society as well when we have this culture of honor of our parents. Even when they don't do everything right, we can still honor the position and them in that position for their title in our life. So honor thy father and thy mother. It's an attitude we should have all throughout life, from a young child in the single digits, in infancy, all the way to the end of our life. We may be 70, 80 years old, and if our parents are still living, that honor command is still intact. And let me go even a step further. I was thinking about this as I was studying. I believe that it even goes till after they're gone, as long as we live, because you can think about, some people would be tempted, if there were things that went on, to have an attitude of demeaning their parents after that their parents have passed away, because they want to try to get back at them in some way, and they can't get back at them now because they're gone. And so we need to carry that honor even after they're gone, and honoring their memory, honoring their legacy. I'll tell you something that just drives me up the wall, okay, is when I go to a funeral of somebody that I thought was a good person. And, maybe I knew them the last 10, 15 years of their life or whatever, and they might have been up in years. And you go to the funeral, and somebody, maybe one of the children or some family member, gets up there and tells something that is just awful that person did maybe 40, 50, 60 years ago. And it's like, did you really have to say that? Did you really have to bring that up? Because in my lifetime that I knew them, let's say, they might have never would have done that. They would have said, I'm ashamed of that, if you had talked about that, and wish they could have changed it. So we need to be careful, even after our parents pass away, that we honor their memory, honor their legacy, and speak in a way that would be proper about them. So honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Ephesians 6, we talked about that. And then it's kind of the same deal as this scripture that I read recently, I believe, from Proverbs 10:27. This says, the fear of the Lord prolongeth days, but the years of the wicked shall be shortened. Again, not to say that everybody that fears the Lord and respects Him, takes Him seriously, is going to live to 100 years old or whatever it would be. The Lord knows the days of our life before we even reach Him. He knows what we're going to live to. But it's just that we won't shorten our life through the dishonoring of the Lord or the dishonoring of parents, and we will add to our life of what it would have been if we had not done so. So let's go to another scripture now, Leviticus 19:3. We're still building on this Old Testament concept here about honoring parents. Leviticus 19:3. Let me get to that real quick here. I'm just about on it here, and I'm flipping to another place. Here we go. Leviticus 19:3. Ye shall fear every man his mother and his father, and keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Now, part of that right there is under Old Testament law, the part about the Sabbaths, and we'll speak about that here in just a minute. But you look at that word fear. This is the same idea here when we talk about fearing the Lord. Now, we're not talking about being anxious and terrorized by Him or anything like that. We're talking about that attitude of respect and reverence for the Lord, taking Him seriously. How many would agree that any child is supposed to take their parents seriously as well? Yeah, I mean, it's not this attitude that we see in a lot of kids these days. You go to the store or whatever, and it's like their parent, Now, let me hit on both sides here. Sometimes disobedience can be on the fault of the parents because they don't come behind with legitimacy in the discipline that they threaten. You ever heard a parent go 1, 2, 3? And nothing happens sometimes. You know what I mean? So what does the kid do? They learn, well, it don't mean anything when they say 1, 2, 3. Now, some parents, it really did. It did mean it with my parents. 1, 2, 3 meant something. But for some parents, and I'm hitting on the side of the parents here, that sometimes disobedient kids is a lot to blame. Many times it is to blame on the parents because they don't follow through with the things that they threaten. But then on the other side, there is that attitude that has been cultivated in the kids where they don't take their parents seriously. And so they're not, as this verse would say, fearing their mother and their father. And that taking them seriously, respecting and reverencing them. Ye shall fear every man his mother and his father. And then when it talks there about, and keep my Sabbaths, that's an Old Testament command. We know in the New Testament we are released from that Saturday Sabbath keeping. We're in the new covenant of grace, and that's why we gather on Sundays. We gather on Sundays as the Lord's Day. A good verse to jot down on that is Colossians 2:16 through 17, where it said, Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of an holy day or of the new moon or of the Sabbath days, which are a shadow of things to come, but the body is of Christ. So in other words, this part about the Sabbath days, Jesus is our Sabbath rest. We're released from that Saturday Sabbath keeping. We gather on Sunday, being the Lord's Day, because Jesus rose from the grave on Sunday, the first day of the week, and that's the way the early church seemed to do it as well. So, but we are to honor, this first part of it is repeated in the New Testament. So we're still to keep the honoring of the parents, the fearing of them in this way. The obedience really would be tied to this command here. I am the Lord your God. Okay, let's keep building and let's go to Matthew 15 now. Headed to the New Testament to Matthew 15. And let's look at a story here where the scribes and the Pharisees were violating this command with their tradition. Okay, Matthew 15, verses 1 through 6. Then came to Jesus scribes and Pharisees which were of Jerusalem. So this is that, ongoing thing that Jesus kept having with these religious leaders of the day that thought they had it so together. And Jesus kept having conflict with them because Jesus had it right and they had it wrong. I mean, that's just the way that it was. But the scribes and the Pharisees come to him saying, "Why do thy disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they wash not their hands when they eat bread." Okay, now notice a key phrase in that verse. The tradition of the elders. This wasn't the law of God that they were complaining about, that the disciples weren't keeping. This was the tradition of the elders. And it seems to be that the scribes and the Pharisees, the religious leaders, had these oral traditions that had been passed down verbally down through the generations. They claimed that they came from Moses, but we know that it was only what God gave Moses to write down that should have been passed down. It's probably just a phony thing to say it even came from Moses. More likely it's just the things that they had gathered in their minds, and it was their traditions. It wasn't the laws of God. It was the traditions of the elders, and one of these traditions was that they would wash their hands when they ate bread. Now, I'm not against that. I think that it can be a good, clean thing to do if you're going to eat bread, is to make sure your hands are clean or to wash them. But one commentator explained it like this. Hand washing was not for hygienic purposes, but for ceremonial cleanliness. That's what these religious leaders were wanting, was a ceremonial cleanness of the hands. The OT, or Old Testament, did not require washing before every meal, but tradition grew, one, from Exodus 30:19, where the priests were to wash, two, Leviticus 15, where those who touched something unclean, according to the law, were to wash. By Jesus' time, washing before meal, or meals maybe, had become a major part of Jewish religious life. One early rabbi, listen to this, was excommunicated for not washing properly. Not only was washing before meals commanded, but washing after and even between the individual courses was also considered a religious ceremonial duty. Can you imagine? Say, I got to be right with God, so I'm going to go wash my hands. Okay, I got to wash my hands, and then I'm going to eat my green beans, and then I'm going to wash my hands again, and then I'll eat my pork chops, and no, they couldn't eat pork, so it would have had to be let's say chicken or something. Wash my hands again, and then I'll eat my mashed potatoes, wash them again, eat my carrots. You talk about legalism on steroids. Oh my, legalism on steroids. They thought that they had to keep washing their hands to be ceremonially clean with the Lord. Well, Jesus confronts this after they have brought this up. They see, the disciples of Jesus, they're not following our tradition. They're just going on like they don't care about this ceremonial washing of the hands. Why do they transgress our tradition? Well, here's Jesus' answer starting in verse 3. But he answered and said unto them, Why do ye also transgress the commandment of God by your tradition? That's kind of a mic drop moment, isn't it? You're worried about my disciples transgressing your tradition. How about the commandment of God that's your transgression by your tradition? They were stepping on God's command with their tradition. And he gives the example right here in verse 4. But God commanded, saying, Honor thy father and mother, and he that curseth father or mother, let him die the death. But ye say, Whosoever shall say to his father or his mother, It is a gift, by whatsoever thou mightest be profited by me, and honor not his father or his mother, he shall be free. Thus have you made the commandment of God of none effect by your tradition. Okay, so let's go back and talk about this. So first of all, he's given them what God has commanded, not what the tradition of God was. God didn't give a tradition in this way. He gave a command. For God commanded, saying, Honor thy father and mother. Of course, that goes back to what we read there in Exodus 20 and verse 12. But then he also brings up another one here. And he that curseth father or mother, let him die the death. And that could be traced back to, I'm not spotting it on my notes here, but I think it's Leviticus where it could be traced back to, Exodus 21:17. Here it is. And he that curseth his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. Boy, some kids ought to be glad we're not living under the Old Testament law. And I tell you, it would have been a different story. So we're glad of that. But that goes back to Exodus 21:17. But then here's what they said. This is what the religious leaders said. Whosoever shall say to his father or his mother, it is a gift, by whatsoever thou mightest be profited by me. In other words, what they seem to be saying there is the money that I would help you, father, with, that I would help you, mother, with, it is dedicated to God as a gift, and I can't help you. Can you imagine saying to your parents, say they're in a time of financial desperation. Maybe your parents are still living, they're about to be kicked out of their home, they don't have anywhere to go, and you look at them and say, I'm sorry, I can't help because all my money that I would help you with is just dedicated as a gift to God. You're just out of luck with me. That would seem heartless, wouldn't it? That would seem heartless. That would seem cruel to not be willing to help your parents because you say, I'm sorry, the money's just all the Lord. I mean, that seems religious, maybe would be to some people, but it's actually very cruel. But what the religious leaders of that day were doing were, if somebody said that, if they said, well, the money I would give to you is dedicated to God, and honor not his father or his mother, he shall be free. In other words, we'll let you off. You're right with God. Well, you don't have to worry about a thing. And see, I think that was probably tied to money. I think that they wanted money into the temple or whatever, or in their own pockets. As long as they was dedicating that to the Lord, then hey, don't worry. Dishonoring your parents, breaking that fifth commandment or whatever number it was about, honoring your father and your mother. Don't worry about it. If it's a gift to God, we're good to go. You're free. You talk about such a corrupt system that had come up in the scribes and the Pharisees, the religious leaders of that day, that somebody could dishonor their parents and they would say, you're free, you're good to go. So then Jesus said at the end of verse 6, thus have you made the commandment of God of none effect by your tradition. In other words, you're just walking right on top of it and just acting like that it's nothing. You're just making it of no effect by your tradition. They were focused on such external things, of the washing of the hands, yet the very things of the heart, the things of love, of honoring your parents and treating them well, they didn't care anything about. And Jesus tells them later in this story, washing your hands, he says in verse 20, in fact, these are the things which defile a man, things he had talked about, but to eat with unwashed hands defileth not a man. In other words, if your mother dies cooking chicken and don't get her hands washed before she dies, she's still going to go to heaven if her heart was right with God. Anyway, there was a problem going on when Jesus came to this earth that he had to get straightened out. So, to eat with unwashed hands defileth not a man. Now, we can bring this into an application for today. Society today doesn't focus on ceremonial cleanness so much as the Jews and stuff would have. But we can say this, that there are most likely people today that would say, I'm going to do something for the Lord, or maybe they're in ministry or something to that effect, and they would neglect their parents and try to make it into a spiritual reason. I'll give an example. If somebody feels called to travel and evangelize, maybe they're a preacher, an evangelist, maybe they're a singer or something like that, and if they came up with the idea that they would travel around, and let's say their parents got in a place where they were really needing help. Maybe they were an only child, or maybe the other kids had already passed away or something, and whatever the reason would be, they needed to be with their parents. Can you imagine if that person, that preacher, that singer would say, I'm sorry, God's called me to go around and spread the gospel. I can't help my mother or my father. That would be heartless. It would be cruel. So that's kind of an application we can bring it in today. To obey is better than sacrifice. That's what the Scripture teaches us. And we might say, well, I'm giving my gifts as a sacrifice to the Lord. Giving my money, giving my time, my abilities to the Lord as a sacrifice to Him. Well, to obey is better than sacrifice. And something we need to obey is to honor our father and our mother. We need to obey that because it is the right thing to do. So you can bring that into an application of today. Now, Proverbs 23:22. Let's just read one verse there, and then we're going to kind of settle in on some of this for the last part of the lesson. Proverbs 23:22. It says, "Hearken unto thy father that begat thee, and despise not thy mother when she is old." So that word hearken there is the idea of give ear to or be obedient to. Thy father that begat thee, in other words, thy father that helped bring thee into the world, and despise not thy mother when she is old. In other words, don't disrespect your mother when she gets up in years. And there's different ways you could say that would be applicable. Don't despise the advice and the direction that she would try to give us when she's old. Don't write her off because she's old and say, well, she don't know. She was raised in a different generation. No, pay attention to that. Don't despise thy mother when she's old. Another application would be don't despise her when she's not able to function and do things physically as she was when she was younger. I'm afraid some people have that. They may get irritated at their mother because she can't do the things she used to could, or she has to have a lot of help or whatever it would be. Don't despise thy mother when she's old. She's your mother. Honor your mother. Honor your father. And the same would be true of fathers. Don't despise your father when he is old as well. I want to talk about that some more, but let's go to that Ephesians 6 now. And let's look at 3 verses in Ephesians 6, and we'll pretty well stay here for the rest of the time. Ephesians 6, starting at verse number 1. Let me get here real quick. I could look at it in my Sunday school book, but let me just get to it in my Bible real quick. Ephesians chapter 6. And we're talking here about both the idea of obedience and the honoring of our parents. So he's talked about the Spirit-filled life in chapter 5, and he's given instruction for the wives, instruction for the husbands, and now he gives instructions for the children. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Verse 2 and 3, honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with thee, and thou mayest live long on the earth. Okay, so children, obey your parents. Let's start there. If we're talking about children here, as I said earlier, we would not consider this a command that would be lifelong binding, a command till death. You know, like I say, a 70-year-old is different in the relation to their parents than a 7-year-old is or a 6-year-old. But the child, when it's under its parents' authority in the home and so forth, the Bible instruction is for children to obey their parents. But notice what it said there. This is a pretty key phrase, in the Lord. We know that God would not require any child to disobey Him at the expense of honoring their parents. Now, I want to balance that because we have to be careful because children are still in the process of learning what is right and what is wrong. And when they have a question about it, then they should err on the side of obeying their parents because they're still young and they may not understand. Maybe they think something's wrong, but maybe they're just misunderstanding about it. One thing they could do is talk to their pastor, talk to a Sunday school teacher and say, my mom is asking me to do something that doesn't seem right. What should I do? And let the Sunday school teacher or the child or the pastor, whoever it would be, a good Christian friend or family member, give them instruction on that. But it does say in the Lord, and let me read what one commentator said. They said, that is as far as their commandments agree with those of God and no further. No parent, this is very true, no parent can have a right to require a child to steal, to lie, or cheat, or assist him in committing murder. I mean, can you imagine if one, they said, take this in there and help me with this crime. I mean, that would be the right of the child to say, I'm not going to do that. That would be when the obedience to parents would go out the window and say, we're not doing this. And I pity the child that would be in a situation like that. That would be one of the hardest things to be in. Or in doing any other wrong thing. No parent has a right, listen to this, to forbid a child to pray, to read the Bible, to worship God, or to make a profession of religion. The duties and rights of children in such cases are similar to those of wives. See the notes on Ephesians 5:22, he says. Because the wife, it talks about to obey in all things, but we know that God would not have a wife to do things that would be sin at the expense of being submissive to her husband. So that's that little fine print, you might say, on a wife's submission, same way on a child's submission, not to the point of sin. And in all cases, God is to be obeyed rather than man. When a parent, however, is opposed to a child, when he expresses an unwillingness that a child should attend a particular church or make a profession of religion, such opposition should in all cases be a sufficient reason for the child to pause and re-examine the subject. And that's what I'm talking about, going to a pastor, a Sunday school teacher, family friend that would be Christian. He should pray much and think much, and inquire much before in any case he acts contrary to the will of a father or mother. And when he does do it, he should state to them with great gentleness and kindness that he believes he ought to love and serve God. So that's the extreme case right there. And as I say, I pity a child that would have to be in that type of a case. But the normal application of obeying the parents is in all things. Obey your parents. And in most cases, by far, the counsel of God would be to obey parents. And Colossians 3:20, in fact, let me just read that from the Sunday school book. We have the Colossians 3:20 printed there. That's a very similar verse here. Children, obey your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing unto the Lord. And we know that doesn't include sin, just as we've been talking about, but it's well-pleasing unto the Lord. The Lord is pleased with an obedient child. Parents are too, but the Lord is pleased with an obedient child. And it says there in the verse that we were reading in Ephesians 6:1, for this is right. This is just the way that a child is to live. The Bible tells us that rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. It's a bad thing when a child gets a rebellious spirit, and a child that has a rebellious spirit, they've not learned to submit themselves under the authority that God has set up in the home with the parents. Most likely that child is going to grow up and have trouble submitting to authority in every other area of life because they've not learned it in the home. Maybe they've not been taught it properly. Maybe they've just not submitted to the teaching properly. But most likely, the things that we see in the world today with crimes being committed, so many people in prison and in jail, and all these things that happen in the world, I would not be surprised to see if many of those children grew up in homes where they were not taught how to obey properly, to obey their parents. Sometimes they may not have even had their parents with them. The father may have been absent. I believe I heard somebody say one time that they went into a prison or a jail or something, and they asked those people in the prison how many of them were raised without a father, or a father that was just about not there, or something to that effect, or something to do with the problem with the father. And it was like maybe almost every hand went up. There's a big responsibility on the mothers, but there's a big responsibility on the fathers to get it right. And many people in this world don't have a good father, and they've maybe walked out or done things that shouldn't have been done. It's interesting to note that the Bible tells us that disobedient children is one of the characteristics of the last days. There's that passage over in 2 Timothy 3 talking about, this know also that in the last days perilous times shall come. For men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers. Here it is. Disobedient to parents. That's that part of the perilous times of the last days before the Lord comes back. And it gets down to the end. It says, having a form of godliness but denying the power thereof, from such turn away. These things right here are not to be attitudes of our own life. And I just believe that a lot of the wickedness we see in the world, I believe we're in those perilous times of the last days. And I believe it can be probably a lot traced to the way children were raised, and they were not taught to be obedient. Now, when we talk about children obey your parents, let's just assume that it's not something that's sin that they're asking a child to do. There's a few elements, I think, that need to be contained in obedience. One is pretty obvious, doing what they tell you to do. I think that's just a real obvious one, is just do it. I mean, don't mouth about it. Here's another thing, don't delay either. Do it when they tell you to do it. Somebody said something like this, and it's a little bit skewed, but delayed obedience is not obedience. There's some truth to that. Now, I know that sometimes, the parent may show mercy, grace, whatever, but doing it when they tell you to do it is a part of obedience. Another thing would be not doing what they tell you not to do. Don't eat the cookies. Don't go outside. Don't play in the road. Those are things that are also, of course, a part of obedience. Here's another big thing about it I believe should be included in obedience is having a good attitude while obeying. It's one thing for a child to clean up their room. It's another thing to clean up their room and slam the toys in the toy box and kick the wall and be mouthy while they're doing it. That's not a spirit of obedience while they're doing it. Heard a terrible story one time, and it was about a mother that told her, something like this, told her boy, let's call him Jimmy, might have been his name, to sit down. Sit down, Jimmy. Well, he didn't sit down. Jimmy, I said sit down. Well, Jimmy sat down, but he had a frown on his face. And he looked at his mother and said, I'm still standing up on the inside. You talk about a bad attitude while you're obeying. That's what Jimmy had. I know, doesn't he, though? He needs a spanking. But that even though he had done the act of sitting down, his heart was still in a place of disobedience. His heart posture was still in a place of rebellion. And so obedience is not only the action, obeying the action, but also having a spirit of obedience toward the parent as you obey. Now, verse 2, that's the promise there. That is back in Exodus 20 and 12. And it was in 20 and 12 of Exodus, it was that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. That was the promise of Exodus 20:12, the first commandment with promise. But then as we say, it's translated for us today in this way. This is verse 3, that it may be well with thee. You want it to be well with you? Oh, I think every one of us do. Do we want it to be well with our life and with our soul? Part of that's going to be that we honor our father and our mother. And thou mayest live long on the earth. And of course, we talked about that. A key to that lengthening of life is that we would live to honor our parents. Now, let me just say a few things here in our last little bit here about the honoring of parents. I think you could pretty well say that there's 4 different stages of life in the ways that we honor our parents. Number 1 would be the growing up stage. And obviously, a big part of that honoring of the parents in the growing up stage is going to be to obey our parents, to do what they say. And it's also the way that we talk about, as a young child, the way we would talk about our parents with our friends. None of us would think that a child would have a spirit of obedience if they're out being mouthy about their parents to their little friends at school and everything. That's part of that. Honoring our parents is the way that we talk about them. Are we demeaning them or are we esteeming them? What kind of remarks are we making about them to our little friends and stuff like that? So in the growing up stage, you've probably all experienced this when you're raising children. There's going to be times when a child is not going to understand why you're making them do what you're making them do, or why you're limiting them from doing what they want to do. And they just need to have that spirit of obedience. And one thing about it, this, of course, I think probably we could all say it's especially in the teenage years. Wouldn't you agree? They want to go to a friend's house. They want to be involved with something. And they must be determined that they're going to honor their parents even if they don't understand it at the time. See, that's something that children have to learn, because we got to learn it in life with the Lord. We got to obey Him even when we don't understand it. See, that it translates, doesn't it? You're learning it in childhood that you obey your parents when you don't understand sometimes. It's going to be the same way with the Lord. His ways are higher than ours. With a child and a parent, child's understanding is sometimes down here. They're still maturing, still learning. A parent's ways are higher than the child's ways, because the parent has grown to an older age. They understand more things. And so we have to learn that young to help us. We need that to learn that young, so it helps us understand with the Lord when we're old. But a good doctrine, I thought about this. This is just kind of a light bulb thought to me. And I'm adding to it here some from what I originally thought. But a good doctrine for any child or teenager to learn early on is the doctrine of the sovereignty of God, that God is in control, and you could put with that, God is taking care of us as His children. He is on our side. He's going to watch out for us. It's going to be okay. And if a child will get a good handle on that, God's watching out for me, it's going to be okay, then that will help them when they don't get to go to that friend's house that they wanted to go to. The world's not going to come apart because I didn't get to go to that friend's house. It's not the end of the world that you didn't get to be involved with that in school or whatever it would be. If you just realize God's watching out for me and it's going to be okay. That's a good doctrine for a child to learn. That's a good doctrine for an adult to know. God's in control. It's going to be okay. So that's the growing up stage there. Now, the next one I would say would be the midlife stage. Maybe we grow up, we get married, and we start a family on our own, move out of the house, and so forth. Then there's that midlife stage where the obedience command to parents has been fulfilled, but the honor command is still there. And when you're in that midlife stage, we need to think about what are the choices. This is the way we would honor our parents in midlife. How are the choices that I'm making today going to reflect on my parents? In other words, am I going to shed bad light where people would say, well, boy, they must not raise them good? What are the choices that I'm making? How's it going to reflect on my parents? Also things like when we make decisions, do we value their counsel? That they would say, son, I wouldn't do that. Honey, I don't think that's a wise decision for you to make there. And they're not trying to control you. They're not trying to be hovering maybe at times, but it's a good counsel. Good godly counsel. We need to be willing to receive that. I was reading in Proverbs this morning. I had 2 or 3 different times in that chapter 15, which coincides with today, February 15th, about reproof. If we refuse reproof, we're going down a bad road. If we won't allow ourselves to be corrected at times, not just as a young child, but at any time in life. If we won't receive good, constructive criticism, then we're going to be going down a bad road. We don't know it all. We got to have the help of the Lord and the help of other people. So that midlife stage. Here's the truth. This is so. I'm going to say this sarcastically. Okay, this is so deep. You may have to have a doctorate to get this, okay? I don't even have one, so we may all be in the water, okay? No matter how old you get, your parents are older than you are. Isn't that deep? Not really. It's just simple. But so I'm just playing. But the truth is, they've been down the road further than we have. Isn't that the truth? No matter how old we get, our parents are still going to be that they have traveled down the road further than we have. If you were to go on a trip and you were to say, well, I went out to Dallas or whatever, and your children were going to Dallas, you could tell them, well, this is the best road to take. This is the restaurants I'd recommend you eat at. Don't go down this road because, boy, that was a dead end. We had to turn around and wasted a bunch of time because you've been down the road before. It's not necessarily that one is better than the other. The children may even grow to be have more knowledge than the parents may have had sometimes. But there's still that matter of being down the road further and being through more life experiences that they can help us with at different times in life. Okay, now just in the last minute, let me cover this one: the elderly stage of life. That's so important that we continue to honor our parents in the elderly stage. Many people, I'm afraid, their parents get to where they are physically unable to live by themselves, and they just put their parents in a nursing home and forget about them and don't hardly do anything toward them or visit them. Again, very heartless, very cruel, and that's not honoring our parents. We need to be taking care of them and honoring them in the ways that the Lord would have us to do that all the way to the end. And then the 4th stage would be that even after they're gone. Even after they're gone, honoring their legacy. And as I say, sometimes there's situations that are bad, abusive, or neglectful, and you say, well, what can I do? You can honor that position even if the actions cannot be honored. The Lord will help us. He'll bless our soul, and it'll bless society, and it'll bless our families if we operate in the plan of God for how He set things up in life. It'll work if we'll do it His way. Amen? Amen. All right. Thank you for being in Sunday school today. We'll take a break and we'll start service in just a few minutes.